perfect day, but November 11th, to be having Timothy here as our guest. So we're particularly honored to welcome him tonight to Book Passage and to welcome all of you to our store here in the Ferry Building. Thank you so much for coming. I think many of you know Timothy. He's with us tonight from Georgia State University, and thank you for coming all that way. But a lot of you, I think, are here because of the topic, and that's a wonderful combination of people who are here to support a friend and people who are also here just because you feel passionately about the topic, as Tim does. So I have read a little bit about his book and about his background. I'm very excited to hear this. Unfortunately, last week told the tale about what's happening with capitalism and democracy in the country right now, but we can look to the future, and I think that Dr. Cooner is going to give us some tips on how to do that. So thank you again for being here, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Cooner. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for making the trip out. I know there's a lot to do in the Bay Area, and I'm honored that you're taking the time to be here with me and with each other. So I wrote Capitalism versus Democracy because of what I perceive as a fundamental change in the American political system. And that's a change that sets where we are and where we're going as a mode of government in a very different place and in radical juxtaposition to what I think most of us learned in school, to what I think most of us learned about our political system in, say, when we read the mainstream media, even when you attend college classes in sociology, political science, government, and the like. I don't think the story of what American, quote, democracy is becoming is very clearly or very honestly told. And so fundamentally, this is a book that attempts to expose what I perceive as a radical transformation in our mode of government. And that transformation has been accelerating in the last 4 decades or so. And what I'd like to do tonight is confront it. I'd like to welcome you all to take a little thought experiment, a little intellectual journey with me, and try on for yourselves the veracity of what I'm about to allege. And I'm going to lay it out in 3 different parts. The first part is called American Plutocracy, not to give away what I see the fundamental change to be, but the first part is indeed called American Plutocracy. The second part is the origins and causes of that rival system of government. And the third part is a way forward, and in particular a way forward that would be long-lasting and foundational, as opposed to a way forward that would be tinkering around the edges or moderate little pieces of change. Now, the midterm elections have given us a very convenient starting point for this discussion. There's a remarkable decrease in the midterm elections. And you know this is a book about money and politics, and so when you hear me say decrease, you're probably confused. I'm not referring to a decrease in money and politics. I'm referring to a decrease in voter turnout. So voter turnout this past election cycle was actually 36.4%, and it hasn't been that low since 1942. When in fact it was 33.9%. So there's this record low in voter turnout, and then there are some record highs. And of course, when I say record highs, now I really am talking about money and politics. And we could go through, for example, the $650 million in outside spending. And by outside spending, I mean super PACs and dark money groups primarily. And so your super PACs are these quote, independent expenditure organizations that exist to funnel large sums of mostly unregulated money, which can come in unlimited sums from corporate general treasury funds or from millionaires, from billionaires, from whoever wants to pay, and can flood media markets. And that is a lot of what I think most people experience the midterms as, this commercialized carnival of trivial, misleading, almost hate speech. And maybe that has something to do with the decrease in voter turnout, actually. But we don't need to speculate too much. I think there's some concrete things we can put our fingers on, and I'll give you one of them. 2 major super PACs, one on the Democratic side, one on the Republican side, the Senate Majority PAC on the Democratic side, Karl Rove's American Crossroads on the Republican side. Together they raised about $90 million. Of those $90 million, 2/3 of it came from donations of $500,000 or more. So you can get a sense of who the donors are by virtue of the fact that most of them are giving checks for sums of money that most of us hope to earn over, I don't know, 3 or 4, over a decade or so, if we're lucky. But they've got that kind of disposable income, right, to flood a media market. And you see that happening actually, and again, I don't think this is coincidental, with some key politicians, namely politicians who have come out in favor of campaign finance reform. So the politicians who would regulate the big donors and the big spenders and the outside expenditure groups have actually come under fire from, well, who would you expect? The people who they would regulate, right? So if you look at the congressional sponsors, co-sponsors of the Disclose Act, which is one of the latest pieces of legislation that would restrain big outside money, they had remarkable outside expenditures spent against them in these midterm elections. So you can talk about Mark Udall in New Mexico, the $24 million against him, Kay Hagan in North Carolina, the $20 million against her, Bruce Bagley in Iowa, the $19 million against him, Mark Begich in Alaska, the $13 million against him. We still don't know if he's lost. He appears to have lost, but he's not conceding yet, or at least as of 8 hours ago. If someone has breaking news, let me know. But so it's remarkable that you can take this kind of political position, which is consistent with the opinions of about 80% of Americans that you'd like to limit money in politics, and that position earns you these massive expenditures against you in your election campaign. So the very interests you're intending to regulate have a very powerful way of making sure you don't have the chance to see that regulation through. Another story from the midterms that I found striking and very telling comes from Michelle Nunn's campaign in Georgia. And of course, Nunn lost, but it wasn't on account of lack of fundraising. Nunn's campaign memo, which was leaked to the press, advised her to spend 70 to 80% of her time raising money. So there were 2,500 campaign hours in the year leading up to the midterms. Of those 2,500 hours, Michelle Nunn was advised to spend 2,200 of them raising money. And that's not a sort of anecdotal piece of evidence. Actually, you can find enough stories that are similar to make it cease to be anecdotal and to become actually characteristic of the system. So on average, your office holders running for re-election and your candidates are spending half or more of their time meeting and calling donors, meeting and calling potential, well, they're not supposed to call the outside expenditure groups, but there's a big question mark about that. In any case, they're spending a lot of time with donors and not as much time with their constituents. Even you could take Obama's latest, his re-election campaign, he had about 221 fundraisers to about 101 civic rallies. And so this is starting to characterize the nature of campaigning and then the nature of representative governance in terms of how those campaigns come out. So there's a million statistics out there about this. The last one I'll give you in terms of sort of summing up the way this looks is the presidential election. So if you go back to 2000 with Bush versus Gore, you'll see $325 million in campaign spending. Now, forward 8 years or so, 12 years down the road, and of course you've got at this point you've got Obama versus Romney, and in that 12-year period, there's an 8-fold increase in campaign spending. So you go from $325 million to $2.3 billion. Inflation is not going up quite that high. So this is systemic and consistent in terms of change. Now, the upshot to all of this is economic power is looking for ways to convert itself into political power, right? That's the design at issue. And you could say, no, look, money's speech, some money is necessary to get the word out about political issues. We've got to privatize mass media. Fine. Most democracies around the world recognize that there's some expressive value, some free speech value to political donations and political expenditures, but they always have a countervailing value in their constitution. So it's not just the freedom to spend and the freedom to donate, it's also the interests of others in a democratic society. It's also political equality, it's also democratic integrity. We don't have that balance between values. We have this free speech sort of constitution, right, which we'll get to in a minute. And what that means essentially is, okay, great, so if money is speech, well then the rich can have more of it, right? Okay, if corporations are citizens, well then some citizens have general treasury funds in the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, and other citizens have a negative balance on a credit card statement, right? So it's this remarkably unequal polity that American democracy is growing into. So, all right, so at base, this is about the conversion of financial power into political power. And this leads to a thought experiment that I'd like you to try on real quick, which is how did other conversion processes like that work out? And what I mean is the conversion of a foreign form of power from some other place into political power. So one place you might look would be monarchy, right? You could talk about power of hereditary birth in a noble lineage, the power of kings and queens over the state, both the economy and the political system. Another transmission or conversion process would be religious authority. Religious hierarchy translating into political power, theocracy. How did that work out in most places at most times? And it leads me to wonder, when you think back on those systems, many times they endured for centuries. Now, doesn't that tell you that most people, most of the time, in most of these historical moments, were unconscious about the injustice and the tyranny of their particular societies? Now, you could point me to the radicals that we've had in every era who have died at the guillotine or have been thrown out of airplanes above the Rio de la Plata in Argentina and Chile for opposing the dictatorships there. You can always point to your radicals in any particular moment in history, but until the great majority of the population wakes up and becomes activated, systems of oppression endure. That's the historical lesson that I draw from all of this, and they endure because people either don't recognize them as unjust or don't think it's really worth it, or don't think that they can really make a difference. And so that sort of historical haze is something that I would assume we're actually subject to, that we're probably laboring under a historical haze. And I want to try to get at what I think that haze is obscuring. And the first person who I think can help us with this is that French economist Thomas Piketty, whose Capital in the 21st Century has become a very famous, high-selling book, right? So Piketty says that there's this tendency in capitalist societies, actually pretty much across the globe, and the tendency is rising economic inequality, and the mechanism is returns on capital outstrip returns on labor. And so Piketty traces from 1970 to 2010 in the United States, for example, this process where year after year after year, people who own businesses and stocks and property and so on are getting more returns on their investment than laborers are in the form of a paycheck or a salary. And so there's this growing disjuncture and growing social or economic inequality. And the levels that we've hit remind me of those past eras that we were just talking about. Monarchies and so on, feudal times, for example. So Piketty says, look, take the top 10% of U.S. wealth holders, and they happen to own 70% of national wealth. The top 10% in our society own 70% of all national wealth. The bottom 50%, all right, the lower half of the entire population owns only 2% of national wealth as of 2010. And that's only getting aggravated, actually. So if you look at that kind of inequality, that to me is a wake-up call, even more so when you ask sort of, well, where does it come from, right? So how do you get a society in which returns on capital outpace returns on labor? And Piketty says, look, you can't get these kinds of unequal returns unless you have favorable laws and policies in place. Fair enough. So things like taxation, regulation of financial instruments, fair wages, right? What's the minimum wage? Is it a living wage? Paternity benefits, maternity benefits, public education, healthcare, right? The sort of thing that would contribute to a more egalitarian society tends to be sorely lacking in the United States. And there's a connection there in my mind, because those are policies that are consistently opposed by moneyed interest. And you dig a little deeper and you see that actually between the same dates that Piketty references, 1970 to 2010, there's a coincidence of sorts, which is rising economic inequality in those years is coupled with rising political inequality in the same years. And so there's this rising political inequality on the basis of wealth, and at the same time, lo and behold, there's rising economic inequality, right? And I don't think those things are separate. And neither do the leading scholars, for example, of some recent studies coming out of Princeton, Larry Bartels, Martin Giles, Ben Page, have been talking about politicians being entirely unaccountable to their constituents unless those constituents are wealthy. And these political scientists and economists tend to say that the reason that politicians are so unaccountable and don't produce laws and policies in the interests of most of their citizens is simply that most of their citizens aren't funding their campaigns. Most of their citizens aren't funding the political parties to which they belong. Most of the constituents, most citizens, aren't funding all of the outside speech that is influential in elections. And so there's this competing system with what I think we're used to. And when you look at that competing system, this different type of representative democracy where the donors and spenders are better represented than your average person, I think you've got your second clue as to what the historical haze is obscuring for us. So the first thing is Piketty and that rising economic inequality to unsustainable levels, right? Piketty says, look, this kind of inequality leads to revolution in every era that it's lasted in. And so he actually questions whether there's going to be a revolution and a radical change in our society because historically people can't tolerate that kind of misery for most people and incredible opulence for a few others. Now, the second clue is the nature of how that incredible opulence for a few others is sustained. So again, it's back to money and politics. And what I want to lay out are three obscured truths about money and politics. And again, just try these on. I know I can't convince anyone of anything in 30 minutes or so try these on. Here's the first obscured truth, in my view. What do you call a political system in which there are no limits, no aggregate limits anyway, on what donors can give to campaigns and political parties? What do you call a political system where there are no limits on what outside groups, even corporations, can spend? What do you call a political system in which there are very few public subsidies for campaigns or parties? None, in fact, at the congressional level. So that kind of system, where presidents have to raise about $1 billion, senators about 10 million, members of the House about 1 million, that kind of political system is a privatized version of democracy. Fair enough? Privatized because the routines that office holders have to get into are ones of fundraising, and they're not getting money from the state. And most ordinary people aren't donating really any money at all, actually. And so the system has been privatized. So that's the first thing. We live in a privatized form of government. The second thing is the mechanism behind that system. So if we're in a privatized form of government, how does it work? What's the motor that drives it? And I'm going to let the Supreme Court do the talking on this in terms of results that the Supreme Court has achieved. So take Citizens United, for example, which I think probably most of you have heard of. This is the 2010 case where Justice Kennedy's majority opinion strikes down a longstanding limit on corporate general treasury funds in funding speech in the last 30 or 60 days of a campaign. So the moment where those ads matter the most, right? There's this restriction that said a corporation had to form a PAC, not a super PAC, but a PAC that could only take limited donations from certain sources. It was a more restrained vehicle for political influence. Justice Kennedy's opinion strikes down that moderate restraint on corporate political power. And the 2012 elections, which are of course, the first presidential election to follow that change, you see super PACs spending and outside groups spending about $1.2 billion. To influence the outcome of an election, which is an unprecedented number. But ask yourself, again, what's the mechanism through which a privatized form of government works? Now, what's revealing about that $1.3 billion is that 200 people gave 80% of it. So what's revealing to me is not just that it's $1.3 billion, because if we all gave $10, we'd have a whole lot more than that. But if you simply take that money and you look at its sources, 200 people gave 80% of the money. Okay, so take 200 and divide it by the total population of people who are 18 or over and could vote in the United States, which is about 237 million. And so if you look at the percentage, you get 0.0000084% of the US population is funding and controlling most outside speech in our democracy. Great, so that's an effect in terms of what Citizens United has done. More recently than that, we have McCutcheon. McCutcheon is a case decided by Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion in April of this year. And McCutcheon strikes down a limit on how much money each donor can give to candidates and party committees. So these are not outside expenditures to affect the tone of speech and the issues and so on. It's money given directly to candidates or parties, essentially. All right, so the old limit coming out of Watergate, when the public and the Congress decided it wasn't cool for Richard Nixon to be taking these $1 million checks in exchange for favorable policies down the road, decided that's not a very good way to run a democracy, and we need at least a $123,000 limit in today's dollars. So that was the limit donors were facing. The Supreme Court said that limit was too restrictive, and in its place, we now have $3.6 million as the aggregate limit. So take that $3.6 million limit. Few people are donating quite that much, but there is still a change. And here's that mechanism that's driving the system. Prior to McCutcheon, 0.58% of the United States was responsible for most of the money that went to political parties and candidates, most of those donations, 0.58%. Sounds pretty undemocratic, but after McCutcheon, it's gone down still further. In the midterms, it was about 0.19% of the population giving about 75% of the money to parties and candidates. So you've got a narrowing of the group of people within the US population who are providing the money for our democracy to work. And that narrowing effect is one that concentrates political power in a very small and smaller and smaller slice of people who we call the donor and spender class. So if the donor and spender class are calling the shots, indirectly enough, I would say, but they're calling the shots in one way or another behind how campaigns work, what messages get out, how issues are characterized, what the saliency is, and so on. You have a form of government that or a mechanism for government that I call consumer sovereignty. So forget about popular sovereignty, that theory that government is legitimate because it operates through the consent of the governed. How do the governed express that consent? Because parties and candidates have to be attentive to them after they vote, right? Well, in consumer sovereignty, candidates and parties are more attentive to donors and spenders instead of your average constituents, which is what those studies coming out of Princeton are proving. So that's our motor, consumer sovereignty. And you might think I'm being paranoid about it. And you might think, no, the Supreme Court doesn't really support that. That's just an unintended consequence of their decisions. And so let me tell you a little bit more. 2011, a case called Bennett. This is a case where the Supreme Court struck down a very effective public financing system in Arizona. And the way the system worked, it's a little bit complicated, but here's the essence of it. You would have your regular candidates who take donations and favorable expenditures all from private sources. So your regular privatized candidates, right, in the privatized system of democracy that we have in this country. However, there was an alternative. Candidates could run as publicly financed candidates in Arizona for state office. And when they did, they would receive matching funds when their opponents received influxes of cash from donors or spenders. Once a certain, anyway, it's complicated, but that was the essence of it. So let's imagine candidate Jane, who is privately financed, gets $10,000 in, say, donations or outside support or whatever it is. Candidate Dick on the publicly financed side would get matching funds from the state of Arizona to counter, ostensibly to counter, the speech that was purchased on the private side. Are you with me? So it was this sort of back and forth called matching funds. So the Supreme Court struck that down on the theory that it violates the First Amendment. In relevant part, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Which covers state legislatures too, not just the national legislature. So how did the state legislature in Arizona, quote, abridge the freedom of speech? And it's a funny riddle, actually, because they didn't abridge it. They didn't actually limit anyone's speech. The private donors and spenders in Arizona could do exactly what they had been doing under pre-existing law. There was no change to how much they could donate or how much they could spend. However, the Supreme Court said the effect of this matching fund system is to, quote, diminish the effectiveness of that private spending. Okay? Now, that's a funny way to interpret the word abridge. Abridge becomes a guarantee of effectiveness. Not just that nobody will limit you, but that no political actors, will diminish the effectiveness of your financial power in the political sphere. And so coming out of Bennett, what the First Amendment is a sensitive market needle. The First Amendment now guarantees the optimal, market-determined effectiveness of private donations and expenditures. In other words, the Supreme Court has protected this mechanism of consumer sovereignty from regulation. Are you with me on this? And they do it, they're very honest about it in McCutcheon. Again, the case decided this past April, striking down aggregate donation limits. The court says in McCutcheon that this limit of $123,000 limits the ability of the plaintiff to exercise his expressive and associational rights by contributing to someone who will advocate his policy preferences. The Watergate-era law that capped aggregate donations at $123,000 limited the ability of McCutcheon to advocate for people who would advocate in turn for his policy preferences, meaning it interrupted that form of accountability. Because McCutcheon couldn't give as much money as he wanted to all candidates and parties, those parties then wouldn't represent him and his interests with the same fervency as if his money hadn't been limited and could be given freely and in essentially unlimited quantities. So what the court said to us in McCutcheon is that that old law from 1974 really interfered with consumer sovereignty, yet again. The court goes on, again, if you think I'm paranoid, the court says ingratiation and access are not corruption. Government regulation may not target the general gratitude a candidate may feel towards those who support him or his allies, or the political access that such support may afford. Regulation cannot target that access and influence. This is still a quote, ingratiation and access embody a central feature of democracy, that constituents support candidates who share their beliefs and interests, and candidates who are elected can be expected to be responsive to those concerns. Responsive is the word. That's representation. That's our theory of popular sovereignty, reinterpreted as consumer sovereignty. Let's leave it there for now with McCutcheon. We'll return to that a little bit later. So that gives us the nature of the system, a privatized form of democracy, the motor that drives it, consumer sovereignty. The last question, the last point I want to make about money and politics here is, what's the effect of that? So if consumers are sovereign and have more sway than ordinary geographic constituents, what's the effect? Let me tell you a few things about the donor class. So you already know that the donors are 0.19% of the population in these midterms. You already know that they're 0.6084% in terms of super PAC spending, most of it anyway. So it's an incredibly small slice of the population, fine. 99% of them are white. 70% of them are male. Most of them evidently are quite wealthy. And one thing that the surveys on donors and spenders tend to find is that they're very conservative in terms of their economic ideology. So they tend to oppose affirmative action. Naturally, they're more wealthy. They're opposing larger taxes, entitlement programs, the funding of public education as a general rule. Now, if there's this tiny group of people who's not representative either by sex, by race, by socioeconomic status, even within the geography of the districts they're attempting to influence, many of them are from a different district. So they're really not representative in any way, and their influence has a certain effect, which is very simple. Financial power becomes the last lawful means of political exclusion. That's my contention, that we now have a new era of political exclusion that you can compare back in time to other forms of political exclusion that this country's been through. But the currently dominant one is financial power, socioeconomic status, in my view. What those three features point to then, a privatized system running through consumer sovereignty to the effect of excluding people who aren't wealthy, is plutocracy. That's, you could say, almost they're a working definition of this rival form of government that I allege and submit to you for your own consideration, that I allege to be taking deeper and stronger hold of our political system. Every Supreme Court case that's handed down, every election cycle that passes. So that's part one. Part two, which I promised, was how did this happen? What are the causes? What are the origins? And the start of that story in terms of the origins and the causes is where we left off, political exclusion. So we could start back in 1776 And of course, the greatest evil at the time was slavery. Of course, human beings treated as mere property. Naturally, they didn't even have the vote, of course. They didn't even have freedom, never mind the vote. But there was another form of oppression at the time of the founding and for many decades afterwards that I think many of us forget about, which was those poor white males without property. Many a tear being shed for the poor white males without property who couldn't vote on account of not having property. And in many states, that was about 50% of the population. So we had that form of political exclusion, which was eliminated around the time of Jacksonian democracy, certainly eliminated completely by 1850 or 1840 or so. And you start to see in the United States with the abolition of slavery shortly after Jacksonian democracy, 1865, with due process and equal protection in 1868, you start to see the emergence of a different kind of society, don't you? You start to see this evolution towards political equality, an evolution towards universal suffrage and political equality, right? And it goes through beyond the abolition of slavery and due process and equal protection to African American suffrage, to female suffrage, to the abolition of poll taxes, to, at the founding, Quakers, Jews, and Catholics couldn't even vote either, could they? So these various forms of exclusion are eliminated little by little. Chinese immigrants and so on, people get the vote. Once people get the vote, the question is eliminating obstacles in the states. So you get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, 1964 to 1965, bringing us into the enforcement of those acts, plus the abolition of poll taxes, but the enforcement of those acts in the 1970s, early 1970s, which is actually the birth of American democracy, not 1776, 1971. That's our pedigree. It's not as old as you think. And the reason it's not so old is political exclusion. So on the one hand, we have this incredible heritage of distinct and pervasive and stubborn forms of political exclusion. On the other side, we have this democratic evolution that gives people across the world hope and makes us that shining city on the hill and so on, right? Jeffersonian sort of democracy. So how does this relate to money and politics? Well, once we get into 1971 with the elimination of other forms of political exclusion and that elimination being enforced on the states, well, there's one form of exclusion left, financial power. And it is really exposed by Watergate. And so we enter into this moment in the mid-1970s where the United States, the Congress, the people, have a choice to make. And there's two choices radically available to them. The first choice is well expressed by John Rawls in his theory of justice. Rawls says the Constitution must take steps to enhance the equal rights of participation for all members of society. Those similarly endowed and motivated should have roughly the same chance of attaining positions of political authority irrespective of their economic and social class. It's beautiful. It goes on for many paragraphs, and of course it's a huge book. You get the point. Economic and social class shouldn't be a determinant of your ability to achieve political power or to affect political power. And Congress, after Watergate especially, sides with Rawls. Federal Election Campaign Act. In particular, 1974 and 1976 amendments. So Congress limits campaign contributions, limits expenditures by campaigns, by outside groups, by candidates themselves, saying, geez, we need to equalize the relative ability of all citizens to affect the outcome of elections. Part one. Part two, we need to slow the cost, this rising cost of elections, to open our political system more widely to candidates without access to large sources of money. All right, so that's Congress in 1974. They also want to eliminate corruption, quid pro quo, bribery sorts of things. But they have these broader Rawlsian ambitions, fair enough. And those are enacted into this act in the form of limitations on the role of money in politics. That's choice number one. Choice number two, also becoming, I would say, crystallizing in the 1970s, I think is well expressed by Milton Friedman in his role as a public intellectual. So Milton Friedman gets the Nobel Prize in 1976, and aside from his technical economic work, he becomes very well known for the efficient market hypothesis. And if you're not asleep yet, you are a resilient person and you must drink a lot of coffee. The efficient market hypothesis, just bear with us here, as more stocks, bonds, futures, options, and financial instruments are traded, society moves towards efficiencies. Society moves towards better outcomes that could not be produced in a coordinated way by the government or by any particular firm controlling a market. So the idea is let markets work and society will arrive at the correct prices and the correct valuations and the efficient production and the efficient trading and so on of all of the things that make our society work, right? Friedman goes back to Adam Smith, and I think a quote from Adam Smith that really expresses this well is one that reads like this: "Every man should be left perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way and to bring both his industry and his capital into competition with those of any other man." So you don't regulate the market when you can help it. Friedman calls this a flash of genius, talking about the invisible hand, coordinating the activity of millions of people without regulation. It's this very seductive ideology that moves away from bubbles, speculation, irrationality. Lessons of the Great Depression are forgotten. All right, so that's door number two, or option number two. Now, which do you think the Supreme Court chose when it weighed in on the constitutionality of what Congress had done by limiting expenditures in particular? So just ask yourself if this sounds more like Friedman's efficient market hypothesis or if it sounds more like Rawls's fair value of political liberties. So, every man for himself. So you're guessing the outcome. All right. So here's what the Supreme Court says in 1976. The First Amendment denies government the power to determine that spending to promote one's political views is wasteful, excessive, or unwise. In the, quote, free society ordained by our Constitution, it's not the government, but the people who must retain control over the quantity and range of debate. All right, but who are the people maintaining control over the quantity and range of debate? We've already established that they're this minuscule, tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the richest 1% of Americans. This is what the people, the funders are not the people. The spenders are not they are people, and yes, they have rights, but they're not the people in terms of our theory of democracy. So Congress sort of ignores that inconvenient fact about who the spenders and the donors are, and they say that Congress can't limit spending. And they have theory to explain this. They don't have many facts to explain this. Here's one of the theories they give us. They say, quote, "The best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted into the competition of the marketplace. That, in any event, is the theory of our Constitution. Best test of truth is the power to get itself accepted in the marketplace." Now, where did they get that quote? I see a few people in the audience shaking their heads and doing sort of the Home Alone panic moment. They got that quote from a 1919 dissenting opinion by a remarkable jurist, Justice Holmes. What was the 1919 case Abrams about? Was it about price signals and expenditures in a political marketplace? No. It was about a conviction under the Sedition Act, the Espionage Act, in 1918. And the men who were convicted had thrown leaflets on the street urging the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Russia, 1918. So when Justice Holmes says in dissent, that act, that Sedition Act is unconstitutional, he justifies the idea based on this marketplace metaphor. If you allow people to be convicted and serve jail time because they have an unpopular viewpoint, you're not allowing the electorate or the general public or this marketplace of ideas to be informed by competing views, are you? No, you've censored and penalized people for expressing a competing viewpoint, albeit not in economic terms. They expressed it through leaflets, which may have costed, I don't know, $100, imagine. So when Buckley resuscitates that quote in the majority opinion and uses it as a justification for striking down expenditure limits, they're no longer talking about a metaphorical market, are they? This is an actual financial marketplace where the volume of your spending determines how prominent and how widespread and how much press your viewpoint obtains, right? And so this is no longer a metaphor. This is an actual market that Congress had limited by limiting people's expenditures. Now, that's one side of the story, which says that lowering money in politics is not a good idea. We want a marketplace model. But the Congress had another rationale for this, which was political equality, which I mentioned before, the sort of Rawlsian idea. And the court responds to that directly as well. So it's not just that democracy is this free market. It's also that the concept, this is a quote, that government may restrict the speech of some elements of our society in order to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment. The court reads political equality directly out of the First Amendment, which actually is fair enough. The First Amendment's not about equality, but other parts of the Constitution are. So what the court does is it reads out of the Constitution this idea of political equality in political spending, in the accountability of the political sphere to ordinary Americans. It reads it right out. It doesn't cite equal protection or anything like that. So the First Amendment becomes this unlimited value, and that's especially significant because money became speech. So if money is speech, then and if democracy is a market, the 1919 dissenting quotation, which was resuscitated, you get this free market democratic model, and it was continued in other cases. 1978, Bellotti is a case about corporate spending in referenda decisions submitted to the to citizens of the state of Massachusetts. The law prevented corporations from spending from their general treasury funds on referenda, right? Questions submitted directly to voters. And the opinion in the case simply said, you can't discriminate on the basis of the identity of the speaker. Money's speech, remember? So if someone spending that money happens to be a corporation spending from general treasury funds, laws cannot target the corporation or its general treasury funds for regulation. Discrimination on the basis of the speaker. What Justice Powell says in the case is that the inherent worth of speech in terms of its capacity for informing the public does not depend upon the identity of its source, very much like the 1919 quote. We want the market to decide truth, and the market can't do that if you censor corporate speakers. So says Justice Powell, and there's a whole backstory on who Justice Powell was, maybe we'll get to at the end if there's time or if you're interested in questions. Now, this open market theory of the Constitution is responded to by the Rehnquist Court. After the Berger Court comes the Rehnquist Court, and there are a couple of very notable decisions. I'm just going to give you two of them, Austin and McConnell. And so Austin starts this push against the idea of corporate political power. And the court in Austin talks about the advantages that corporations have in terms of eternal life, in terms of shape-shifting and reincorporation into different forms as entities. It talks about their taxation rules. It talks about the various privileges, the ways that they accumulate wealth that ordinary human beings cannot. And so in Austin, no coincidence here, it's Justice Thurgood Marshall, Brown v. Board of Education, first African-American Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, the lawyer from Brown v. Board, arguing about political inequality again. And he says state-created advantages not only allow corporations to play a dominant role in the nation's economy, but also permit them to use those resources amassed in the economic marketplace to obtain an unfair advantage in the political marketplace. The very conversion process I mentioned at the outset of the talk, financial power converting itself into political power, Thurgood Marshall says that's a valid reason to regulate. We don't want that conversion process in effect. McConnell upholds that idea and cites the corrosive and distorting effects of immense aggregations of wealth that are accumulated with the help of the corporate form and have no correlation to the public's support. If they had a correlation to the public's support, they might indeed be representative, right, of the public's viewpoints, and so that old theory of representative governance could hold true, but the court in McConnell says, no, actually, these economic advantages that the corporate form holds are not correlated with the public's support for the corporation's political ideas. Shareholder rights, almost, right? Now, so we have that idea of undue influence of corporate political power, and this is why Citizens United and McCutcheon are so important. So Citizens United in 2010, I told you about striking down another limit on corporate general treasury funds, but more than just strike down the limit, the court strikes down the theory behind the limit. The court says Austin, about undue corporate influence, Austin interferes with the open marketplace of ideas protected by the First Amendment. Right. It's irrelevant for purposes of the First Amendment that corporate funds have little or no correlation to the public's support. All speakers use money from the economic marketplace to fund their speech. All of the corporate attributes and advantages, limited liability, perpetual life, favorable treatment of the accumulation and distribution of assets, do not suffice to allow laws limiting speech. Can't discriminate against these poor corporations. Favoritism and influence are not avoidable in representative politics, says the court. Favoritism and influence on the basis of corporate political spending are not avoidable in representative politics. It's in the, quote, it's in the nature of an elected representative to favor certain policies and by necessary corollary to favor the voters and contributors who support those policies. So, there's about 5 other really interesting cases that keep elaborating this theory of free market democracy, of a free market constitution. One of the ones, besides Bennett, right, which this gives us this idea of the First Amendment guaranteeing the optimal market-determined level of speech, there's a related case called Davis, which calls a campaign financing scheme that gives advantages to someone facing a wealthy candidate. If you are facing a self-financing candidate who spends $350,000 of their own money on their campaign, you, under this law that was part of McCain-Feingold, could raise larger amounts for a limited time till you caught up, simply countering the role of personal wealth in campaigning. That was Davis, and this is the Roberts Court, so you know they struck down the law. Now, they called the law a leveling scheme. A leveling scheme. They said that leveling electoral opportunities means making and implementing judgments about which strengths should be permitted to contribute to the outcome of an election. The Constitution confers that power upon voters, not the Congress. Totally Orwellian, because who do you think supports the leveling scheme? Voters and the Congress. Congress, to the extent they're not bought and paid for, is looking to protect the power of their geographic constituents and to not have to be telemarketers all day raising money. But the court, sort of in this Orwellian language, says that's for voters to decide. Well, how could voters decide that if not through legislation of some kind or a referendum, right? So if voters decide that personal wealth shouldn't be the criterion for political power, they're not allowed to do anything about that decision, even though formally they have the power to do something. It's frustrating. I mean, the whole point of these opinions is to make your head explode, I swear to God. So now, if this was a leveling scheme, and voters aren't allowed to make these sorts of decisions, nor is the Congress allowed to make these sorts of decisions about which strengths contribute to the outcome of an election, what, pray tell, are those strengths that we're not allowed to interfere with? Leave it to Justice Alito to sum them up. This is the whole quote. Different candidates have different strengths. Some are wealthy. Others have wealthy supporters who are willing to make large contributions. Some are celebrities. Some have the benefit of a well-known family name. He's done. So, right. Civic strengths? Do I have anyone for a civic strength? Can I get a civic strength from anyone in the room? I don't know. Studying public policy issues, being in touch with voters, persuasiveness, being articulate, caring about people, learning about the issues. No, you're a celebrity. You've got a well-known family name, you're wealthy, or you have wealthy supporters. That's how that's fairly accurate, actually. But what's funny about it is not that it's descriptive, it's binding. If that's an accurate and sad statement of the way our political system works today, just a statement, we'd say, great, Justice Alito knows what's happening. But he goes on and he says, that's the way the Constitution demands it to happen. And you're locked into that. You cannot go over the Supreme Court's head unless you've got a constitutional amendment up your sleeve, which we'll get to in a minute. So that brings us up again to McCutcheon. McCutcheon is the one that strikes down aggregate contribution limits and gives us this $3.6 million contributor, which brings us all the way back to Watergate, right? It's funny how honest the court is, again, in ways that will make your head explode. Listen to this one. When an individual contributes money to a candidate, or to all candidates and all parties, to the tune of $3.6 million, that individual exercises rights of expression and political association. those rights are important regardless of whether the individual is a lone pamphleteer or street corner orator in the Tom Paine mold, Common Sense, the American Revolution, someone without whom we may not have ever had independence as a nation, regardless of whether the individual is a lone pamphleteer in the Tom Paine mold or is someone who spends substantial amounts of money in order to communicate his political ideas through sophisticated means. So congratulations to the Koch brothers, congratulations to Bill Gates and George Soros and Sheldon Adelson and Foster Friess, because they are now every bit as democratic as Tom Paine was in the exercise of his political rights. The Koch brothers are Tom Paine today, constitutionally speaking. They must have celebrated that one. And in fact, McCutcheon himself, he tweets a lot. This guy, Sean McCutcheon, tweeted after the midterms that something about McCutcheon power, how the total number of donors had shrunk, but they were giving in greater amounts thanks to the case that he and the Republican National Committee won through the Roberts Court. So he's sort of celebrating this. Reminds me of the property requirement on the vote, when only white males with property could access their political rights fully. We'll save that for another minute. So the other thing McCutcheon does is it says there's only one reason Congress, the people, Congress with the president signing the legislation, can restrain money in politics. There's only one reason, and it's preventing quid pro quo corruption, bribery. The court defines it as an exchange of an official act for money, not favoritism, not access, not ingratiation, not voting the way your donors and spenders would like you to, but doing it because they said, here's a bag of cash, vote this way tomorrow on the floor. That's what can be regulated, not the general dependence of political parties, donors, of political parties and candidates and office holders on the donors. That general dependency cannot be regulated. Democratic integrity doesn't count. Political equality doesn't count. And the court was very honest about that in McCutcheon. So that's where the Supreme Court leaves us in April of this year. And so this is our the subtitle of the book is this free market constitution, right? So money is speech. Corporations are citizens. Political equality is unconstitutional. Democratic integrity is unconstitutional. Redefinition of representative governance through this free market constitution. Now, what's interesting, here's the third part of the talk, sort of where do we go from here and what are our conclusions based upon this information? The first thing that's interesting to me goes back to Piketty. Piketty says the only thing that sustains our record levels of economic inequality is an ideology that justifies those records of political inequality. In other words, oppressive political systems last when there is a justification for them that is taken by the people, enough to disempower them or confuse them or maybe even to persuade them. And so Piketty is on the lookout for justifications for this patrimonial, oligarchic, plutocratic form of crony capitalism, right? And I think what I just laid out for you is the justification. Well, money is speech. Democracy works through competing expenditures and donations these days. It's freedmen in politics. Corporations are citizens. You can't censor them. Democracy is a market. It's celebrating the diversity of viewpoints. It's a disregard for actual evidence and an embrace of this open market euphoria. That's the ideology that Piketty is looking for. And I told him this and gave it to him, and he said that's very depressing. And I've heard him since mention now money in politics as one of the causes for the trends that he's noting. So this makes the Supreme Court, by the way, the only official government actor, the only organ of government in any democracy that I know of or have ever heard of to justify plutocracy. So the book talks about these ideological architects of plutocracy for the reasons I went through. Now, another sort of concluding point about all of this. A lot of what I've described, I think, could be called the corruption of democracy. How does all of this spending on elections and political speech, how does that bode for capitalism? Right? It's this celebration of free market values, but does it favor capitalism itself? Does it favor the integrity of the economic sphere? We know the political sphere is trashed, and it's a shopping mall. But what about our market? Have we emboldened the market? Have we lifted all boats? Have we made a celebration of effort and talent and entrepreneurs and creativity? Have we produced a more vibrant capitalism through all of this rent seeking at the political level. And I'm going to let a couple very progressive, tree-hugging radicals make the point for me. And I'm going to start with Adam Smith. So, Wealth of Nations, 1776, blueprint for American capitalism, most forms of capitalism. Really, Adam Smith in the Wealth of Nations cites our merchants and master manufacturers. And he says that they complain a great deal about the bad effects of high wages. One of the policies, actually, that we talked about in terms of explaining inequality, the low minimum wage. Master manufacturers complain about the effects of high wages, but are silent, this is the quote, with regard to pernicious effects of their own gains. Smith describes those who employ the largest capitals and the dealers in any particular branch or trade of manufacturers as an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who generally have an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who have accordingly done so on many occasions, both deceiving and oppressing the public. How do they do that, you might ask? Smith says, considering that these classes use their wealth to draw to themselves the greatest share of public attention, and that they desire restraints upon competition, and an increase in profits at the public's expense, proposed laws should be long and carefully examined, not only with the most suspicious, but the most scrupulous attention. So Adam Smith is saying rent seeking. The wealthy classes use their money to draw political attention to themselves and to influence the shape of law and policy, and he mentions why they would do that. Restraining competition so that their particular company or particular industry can get ahead, and achieving, perhaps through price supports, which were common enough, gains at the public's expense because goods and services become more expensive, and firms and industries that might otherwise perish are supported by the government and continue to form whatever sort of inefficiencies they want that the public has to pay for. So that's Adam Smith. Another tree-hugging radical progressive who wrote Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, named Ayn Rand, Ronald Reagan's favorite author, influenced Margaret Thatcher, Greenspan was her little protege. Ayn Rand gives us this distinction in one of her books between Andrew Carnegie, Commodore Vanderbilt, and other, quote, giants of American industry. She says that these were self-made men who earned their fortunes by personal ability, free trade on a market. She contrasts them with, quote, another kind of businessmen, the men with political pull, who made fortunes by means of special privileges granted to them by the government. Again, why is there so much political spending? Obviously, people want favorable laws and policies. Why do they want that? It's good for their bottom line. It's good for their material interests. Rand is saying that's a corruption of capitalism. She says the political power behind their activities, the power of forced, unearned, economically unjustified privileges caused dislocations in the country's economy. Sounds familiar. Hardships, depressions, and mounting public protests. You didn't know that Ayn Rand supported the Occupy movement, did you? There you have it. She's their matriarch. Young Alan Greenspan, in Rand's book, criticizes the kind of promoters who always exist at the fringes of the business community and who are constantly seeking an easy deal. Young Alan Greenspan. Now, when I go on about money in politics and rent seeking, I'm not criticizing CEOs in general. I'm certainly not criticizing capitalism, and I'm not criticizing even corporations. What I'm criticizing, and what Rand and Adam Smith are criticizing, is the conversion of their economic power into political power in a way that corrupts democracy on the one hand, and the virtues that Rand and Adam Smith cared about, capitalist virtues. Which sounds ironic today. People, the virtues of capitalism. People will throw you out of a room for talking that way because people are doing so poorly. But in theory, capitalism is a system of emancipation, much like democracy. Adam Smith, Jefferson loved Adam Smith. He said The Wealth of Nations was the best book in political economy out there. You think about the system that our revolutionaries overthrew, right? Mercantilism and King George III, it wasn't just the oppression of political rights, it was also the oppression of economic rights, right? Mercantilism, this system of intervening into the economy to make the king and the state rich at the expense of people who are there working hard, trying to exercise their talents and develop their abilities, right? So there's this injustice that our system of capitalist democracy is a response to. The irony is capitalism overtakes democracy, corrupting both. So that's a little bit about the heroes of capitalism. I'll give you two heroes of democracy really quickly because I think they predict pretty much the same thing that Ayn Rand and Adam Smith do. So let's take, again, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, whose quotation I have lost in my notes. Start with Lincoln, because he's right here. This is the end of the Civil War. There's 1 year left. We don't know who's going to win. He certainly doesn't know he's about to be assassinated. Lincoln says, he references, first of all, the rise in corporate power during the Civil War. And he predicts, quote, an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. He assesses the danger of that in these terms. I feel more anxious at this moment for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of war. It's remarkable. The country could have been dismembered for all Lincoln knew at this point. The battle against slavery could have been lost. And he is more worried about the growth of corporate political power than anything else. The Jefferson quotes, which I've lost, reference a aristocracy founded on our banking institutions and moneyed in corporations is the paraphrasing for an aristocracy. And Jefferson says that if this continues, the few will be riding over the plundered plowman and beggar, is the language he uses. And again, it sounds a lot like Piketty, what Piketty is describing. So I think that's interesting that we have these problems that were predicted by the icons of both capitalism and democracy, and yet we haven't done anything about them yet. Congress has tried. There have been many campaign finance reforms at the federal level and the state level. So when I say we haven't done anything about the problem, I mean the problem of the Supreme Court. Now, thinking about solutions to this, so you've got the United States Supreme Court with its power of judicial review to pass upon the constitutionality of any act at the federal or state or local level. So you can't really get around the court. Some people say, well, just wait for the appointment of new justices. I hate that argument. Because it would be so principled for the financing of our parties, our campaigns, and our outside speech to be a pendulum oscillating between a shopping mall and some public square. Because that would be really principled for an advanced democracy to have radically different rules every decade. It strikes me as ridiculous. And it makes us the laughingstock. So that strikes me, plus the fact that who's to predict that more progressive justices will be appointed anyway? That happened with the Rehnquist Court, and then the Roberts Court happened, right? But even if the progressives were to win through favorable Supreme Court appointments, and let's say that those appointments would endure and that the Supreme Court would remain this progressive bastion of these wise oracles who would maintain campaign finance reform, I still hate it. And the reason I hate it is because judicial review has its limits. When the Rehnquist Court talks about the corrosive and distorting effects of corporate wealth, they're making it up. I mean, I think it's true, but they're making it up as a constitutional matter because the Constitution doesn't address the financing of outside speech, the financing of campaigns, much less the financing of political parties. In fact, political parties aren't even constitutionalized. You can't find the political parties in the Constitution. So, not originally, anyway. So the Supreme Court would be making it up in any case. And what would be much more, I think, befitting of an advanced democracy is to give itself the rules that it chooses to obey, not to have unelected Supreme Court justices giving us those rules. Now, I think the clues for those rules are actually there in Jefferson. When he references an aristocracy of our moneyed incorporations, that's a strong word for Jefferson to use because aristocracy beckons the idea of the nobility and the royalty and the monarchy and so on. And Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, of course, was the official instrument for saying we hate that stuff and you guys, right? So for him to use that word is very strong language. And the other thing about Jefferson is that he opposed not just monarchy but also theocracy. So Jefferson is really remarkable in my view. I admire him so much for his vision that a separation of church and state was necessary, not just for the reason that Roger Williams pointed out, which was to protect religion. The separation of church and state was also necessary to protect the state and democracy from theocracy, right? So Jefferson is really interesting in that way. The other thing is those icons of capitalism. And by the way, there's so many more. There's a bunch of Nobel laureates as well, and University of Chicago economists and Judge Richard Posner, and there's just a million people who talk about the corruption of capitalism through political spending. Now, did you catch the Roger Williams in that? Right? We needed that separation of church and state, not just to protect democracy, as Jefferson said, but to protect religion, as Roger Williams said. So, all right, let's move away from the conversion of religious power into political power and come back to the conversion of economic power into political power. We've said it corrupts democracy, Jefferson. It also corrupts capitalism, right? So it makes it analogous to the situation requiring a separation of church and state, right? You do it for the good of both spheres. And scholars of religion look at that separation and say, we wouldn't have such a vibrant religious toleration in this country and diversity of viewpoints if it wasn't for that separation. It didn't weaken religion for the state not to be promoting it as much as it otherwise would. It gave it independence, and that's what I think capitalism needs, and that's what Piketty's talking about in a lot of ways. Now, so that's on the side of theocracy. Remember I said Jefferson was also revolting against monarchy. How did the U.S. Constitution eliminate the chance of monarchy? It wasn't just that we have an elected president, right, the executive in Article 2. It's that Article 2 of the Constitution is separated from Articles 1 and 3. In other words, even if you had an elected president, what stops him from becoming, or her, Hugo Chavez, right, or some overzealous executive leader who becomes essentially a king? So our framers and founders said we want to avoid that through a separation of powers. So they separated the powers of government into 3 distinct branches in order to avoid monarchy, essentially, among other things. Now, has that put an end to the overzealous executive and seizures of executive power in times of crisis and so on? No. We still get advocates for and instances of overzealous executives, but do we get as many as we would were there no separation of powers? Obviously not, right? That separation preserves democracy in a way that would be totally unfamiliar to us without that constitutional text. So the thing about money in politics is there's a blank slate, and the Supreme Court can do whatever it wants, for ill or for good. Now, so my proposal in terms of reforms is to take this seriously at its root and to say we need a constitutional solution. We need the Constitution to speak on the question of how elections are financed, how parties are financed. And that is, of course, a constitutional amendment, and it's a long battle. Now, at this point, people cite the recent September 11th, 2014 debate over a constitutional amendment on money in politics that went nowhere. There was a majority of the Senate supporting an amendment, but they didn't get the 60 votes they needed for cloture. They didn't get much less the 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the 3/4 of the states. We didn't even get close to that. So people say, therefore, it'll never happen. That kind of hopelessness is a really great recipe for staying exactly where we are. That whole history of civil rights in our country, when you give up on the possibility of a constitutional amendment on money in politics, imagine what you might have said about slavery. Imagine what you might have said about female suffrage or African American suffrage or due process or the abolition of poll taxes. You would have said this is too big and this is too hard, and there are all these organized forces against us. Well, of course there are. But that's the nature of being rooted in your historical moment and saying what is necessary to avoid oppression in my historical moment. Do I want to be part of the solution, or do I want to be a passive, disempowered, cynical standby, a bench warmer, right? So I think that this possibility of a constitutional amendment on money in politics is actually a very hopeful and inspiring place to be, because it would locate you as someone within the civil rights movement. as opposed to someone in this end of history, all the grand battles have been fought and decided, global warming will destroy the planet, corporate power will destroy democracy, et cetera, I'm going to watch my Netflix and eat my popcorn while it's still hot and before net neutrality goes away. It becomes harder to watch there. No, that'll still be there. Then maybe it'll be quicker to watch Netflix. Better yet, I'm giving up. So if you can conceive of our times as still being rooted in the civil rights movement, I think that's a really exciting mental shift to make. And I think that's one that starts to dissolve this historical haze that makes it so depressing to be alive. That's too dramatic. We'll work on rephrasing that on some other point. But I would welcome you to try on those ideas that we live in a privatized form of democracy, activated by consumer sovereignty, achieving the exclusion of everyone but the wealthy, to the effect of corrupting capitalism and democracy. And that, as an alternative, we could imagine a time of revitalized political participation. Do you control the results? Will you win? No, who knows? But you get to live in an exciting and empowered way that reflects the architecture that is unfinished in our political history and in our foundational document. I would take that any day over the whole Netflix and popcorn. Not that you still have time for that, so fine. I'm not saying devote your whole life to this. The amendment to the Constitution is a project that unfolds at municipal, state, and federal levels. So it's something to be part of in local government, in local groups, or if you want, on the national level, however you'd prefer. I'd love to hear your comments and questions. Thanks for your attention. Yeah. Yeah.
And Jeff and so forth, and probably you have one as well. Is that kind of a spoiler mechanism whereby with so many, which are very similar amendments, but some are more comprehensive and deal with the necessity of corporations to contribute to ecological necessities, and others are much simpler, which really deal only with money. What is your recommendation as far as going ahead with trying to get that an amendment passed by simplifying it or by, I don't know.
Right.
What would be your suggestion?
So this isn't a way to dodge your question. It's actually a sincere belief, which is that what we need is the saliency of the issue of money in politics and the need for an amendment before we know what the right text would be. Because what I would envision and what any constitutional amendment has to be, by nature of how many people have to be involved, the state legislatures and so on, it has to be an inclusive process with massive citizen activation. And if we had that level of political will, then I think we'd have a very interesting debate as to what the text ought to be. There's a lot of people who want to get the text first and accumulate political will on the basis of here's the text we need. And that troubles me because then our text would be an elite project one way or another. In other words, I'd like to hear a million more voices on what the text ought to be. But I'll just say a couple things about it. So the Udall Amendment, which was debated in the Senate, restored the purposes of political equality and democratic integrity, purposes which the Supreme Court had said weren't sufficient to withstand First Amendment review. So it restored the legitimacy of those purposes and goes on to say that Congress shall have the power to give reasonable limitations to expenditures and donations and to make distinctions between natural persons and legal persons. But all that does, if you listened carefully, was give Congress authority that it doesn't want to use right now. It just would it would be an amendment that would give the Congress the last word on reasonable restrictions of expenditures and donations and corporate political power. Today's Congress would do nothing about it. So, especially after the midterms, today's Congress would do less than nothing about it. They would go the opposite direction, and we should all be on the lookout for the opposite directions that are coming. Now, the other reason besides my interest in a democratically arrived at constitutional text, the other reason I say it is because I think the only way to get a radically different Congress or a sufficiently different Congress is to make political spending a more salient issue. So if the general public were to decide that money in politics were the most salient issue of the day, not because it's more important than guns or abortion or warfare, but because it's the key to deciding any other substantive issue in a legitimate way. In other words, money in politics is the procedural issue that makes decisions on any other issue legitimate and inclusive, or illegitimate and consumer sovereignty-esque, right? And so if we could push money in politics as the defining issue of the time and get it to be more salient than every other issue, then the vote would be a powerful instrument. But right now, the vote serves to get the attention of representatives on a few issues, but then on issues 10 to 10,000, they do whatever they want, which tends to be what their moneyed constituents want. But if you could get them to run on the basis of their campaign finance platforms and reform that system, then you could have different representatives who might then support a constitutional amendment. So I think it's a grassroots struggle at the moment and for a while. But yeah, please. Oh. I mean, the other thing is there's a real mistake floating around, which is to say the constitutional amendment is an opportunity to revoke corporate personhood. A lot of people are really up in arms about the idea that a corporation is a person for any purpose whatsoever. Don't mix that fight with money in politics. Because if a corporation isn't a person, you can't sue it. And if a corporation isn't a person, it can't enforce a contract. You need certain types of corporate personhood. What you don't need is corporate personhood for purposes of unlimited political spending. So it's a narrow issue within corporate personhood. If you lump that whole corporate, anti-corporate movement in with money in politics, you'll definitely not see the amendment. That's my opinion. Sorry to, yeah.
I think people just are feeling injurious resignation. You had a groundswell of support against not going into Iraq. There were millions of people in the street. After the slaughter of these children, these babies in Newtown, the interest in background checks was, I think, if you told people it was 95%
Right.
GMO labeling. I mean,
Right.
just simple issues that seem so obvious. Climate change. Millions of people have been in the street on that. And a constitutional amendment just seems so much more arcane and almost impossible when you see, like I said, 30 kids that were, 25 to 30 kids that were slaughtered, and you couldn't
Right.
get even background checks, despite the fact that polls were saying that 95% wanted background checks. And so politicians clearly were, in that case, looking to just the very, very tiny amount of economic interests, corporate interests. It was not even NRA members. Even NRA members wanted background checks. Yet nothing, it just demonstrates that almost nothing can get done unless you are one of those people that can write a $100,000 or $500,000 check.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel injurious resignation. I just feel, most people feel just like they have no control, they have their hopeless.
Right.
And those are examples of why, despite, like I said, millions of people, whether it's going to Iraq or GMO labeling or background checks or just issue after issue where the legislators continue to demonstrate that they're not looking out for their constituents' interests.
Right.
Why anyone would vote for a Republican who wants to limit women's reproductive rights, wants no minimum wage, no equal pay for women. I mean, all these different issues. I don't know why anyone would vote these people in society would vote for Republicans, and yet they still keep getting working class and middle class voters to vote against their economic interests.
Yeah, the whole "what's the matter with Kansas" question, right?
I'm not sure if there's even a question in there, but it's just a real statement of helplessness and frustration.
Right. So there's that study, one of the studies I mentioned by a Princeton political scientist and a Northwestern political scientist is one that calls the United States an oligarchy. And it addresses these issues of why office holders are so unaccountable. And it addresses the issue of why ordinary Americans often vote against their economic interests. And it lists money in politics as the main explanation for those things. And so it has a lot to do, I think, with the way these issues, the very ones you said, are portrayed and sold through commercialized political mechanisms. The ability of the president to say there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and to have that message repeat enough in the privatized mass media to the point at which public opinion polling showed most people, like 5 years, 6 years later, still thought there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, even though they never turned up. So I do think there's this sort of crazy disconnect that you get in a commercialized, privatized democracy where office holders know what they need to do.
Well, people in power also wouldn't bother going after any of them, like they did during the S&L
Right.
crisis, where some actually went to jail. So
Right.
now just, causing these criminal activities is just a cost of doing business. They pay a fine and they move on.
Yep.
And taxpayers subsidize those fines.
Yep.
So there's just, the most powerful in society, there's no accountability, they know it. There's never going to be, because politicians are not going to vote against their economic interest, which is the people who write the biggest checks.
So there's a lot wrong, and I couldn't pretend to have answers for all the things you lay out, but I'll just say one other thing about money in politics, which is that the diversity of our political parties on a lot of the things you mentioned is minuscule. And that has to do, in my mind, with the fact that they're collecting money from a lot of the same people. And so if you want diverse political parties, you also have to have diverse financing mechanisms, public financing, small donor financing, to have political parties that could afford to take different positions on the issues. Because they quite literally can't afford economically in terms of their fundraising expenses, their election-related expenses. They can't afford to take the positions that I think you would like them to. Yeah.
I want to bring up electronic voting machines. This midterm elections, it seems there were a lot of sort of referendum type issues that were voted, got positive votes from voters, and then all these Republican people got the vote, and I thought that's an interesting contradiction, and I'm beginning to wonder if maybe they might be using these electronic voting machines selectively to further their agenda in taking control of Congress, for instance. And so I'm wondering if maybe the idea of the electronic voting machine, how it can so easily be hacked and fixed, maybe undercuts any argument about political spending. And maybe political spending is just some kind of a circus that, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you're right, we're in greater trouble than I thought.
Default to what the manufacturers of those machines are, isn't that family a major Republican backer? I mean, Default makes the machines, and there's some question whether during Gore and that election, and well, of course, I guess Obama didn't win those, but
Yeah. I don't have anything on that. It reminds me of the Manchurian Candidate. Wasn't that it sounds...
Well, they've been using these things, selectively over the course of time. So,
So we need journalists on this one,
Yeah.
Investigative reporting.
I was wondering about the new restrictions with voter ID laws and all that. Do you have anything about how that affected voter turnout? Was there any way to measure that?
Yeah, I mean, again...
That's kind of the new poll tax.
Yes, right. So I've been saying that money in politics is the new dominant form of political exclusion because we had the Voting Rights Act and we had the Civil Rights Act and the enforcement of those, and that was all sound and sealed and done with. And so now it's just political exclusion on the basis of wealth. But in fact, the Supreme Court is eating away at this legislation, right, and removing important means of supervising and reviewing state laws on elections that can lower turnout or lower the ability of people to actually, once they've turned out, to cast their vote, right? And I haven't seen any studies yet showing that is responsible for the record low level of voting, but it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Texas and Florida probably are good examples.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sonny Davis probably could have won,
Yeah.
and Scott in Florida probably would be governor if
Yeah.
that voter ID law hadn't been implemented just weeks before the
Yeah.
election.
It seems like a sound theory. I just don't know how to measure it. We'd have to get survey data and polls on people who had turned out and couldn't vote. I don't know if officials keep a record of how many people they turn away. I simply don't know, but it's definitely
It's hard to measure because people just stay at home too.
Right.
People just
right.
can't vote, can't go. So.
Right.
I have two questions. So, in fact, you were only talking about the United States, right? Or do you have any hints that it's like in another democratic system, like outside the US, the same way? First question. The second question. So, adding another passage in the US Constitution is, in my opinion, like the final step on a bigger staircase.
Yeah.
Because like I I guess in the US, to add a passage in the Constitution, the Congress or the House of Representatives has to like vote on that. So to get like the members of the parliament to become members of the parliament, you have to go through all this vote election system,
Right.
and that goes back to funding and
Right.
all of that. So what are concrete steps to take, like the first steps to take to get that passage into the Constitution?
Great. So in terms of other democracies, the U.S. is at an extreme. It's at an extreme in terms of the lack of viable public financing for elections, not just financing for candidates, but also financing for political parties. So a very common thing, as you probably know, in many European and some Latin American and South African democracies, is public financing to the tune of about 50% of parties' election-related expenses. And this doesn't always work. This isn't always a happy story, because a lot of times what happens is the political parties take that money from the state and legislate greater and greater public funds for themselves and become more and more distanced from whatever their constituents might want, because they've got this power of the purse over their own budgets. And it also tends to explain high levels of public corruption in, say, in my mind, in a lot of Western European countries, take Spain or Greece. There's a lot of money to be made on the inside by winning elected office. And also money from the outside in terms of wealthy supporters or corporations or what have you, but there's also this really big public pot of money that you can steal from, siphon from, and get these bank accounts in other countries, right, and save it up. But most other democracies do have public financing to one level or another, advanced democracies, and they often have free media time, which we don't have.
But isn't that another story? Like the one thing is getting like the politicians getting rich, and the other thing is which laws are being passed. Like these are two stories. Like the one thing, being elected in the first place, you need the
Yeah,
money.
right.
Second, in Europe, you get rich once you're a politician. So that's
Yeah.
like two different stories.
Yeah.
So that's not like the same thing.
I don't think it's the same thing as the United States at all. In fact, a lot of office holders in the United States, 50% of senators to be precise, after their terms are up or they lose an election, they go on to become lobbyists and make much more money on K Street. And there's this quote about Capitol Hill being a stepping stone to K Street, where the lobbying firms are located close to the White House. No, I think in European democracies and in Latin American democracies, it plays out in different ways, but we have something to learn from them, which is too much public financing is a bad thing, but some public financing is essential to producing some autonomy for political actors. And some free media time is essential to giving a voice to people who don't or can't raise so much money. But this does go then into, I think, your second question, which is if office holders have to raise so much money and do this whole plutocratic game in order to get elected, why on earth would they reform the system once they're in it, right? And one of the answers to that is a lot of them hate it. It's a game that they play reluctantly. The story that I'm telling isn't one where there are too many evil, bad actors. The case of office holders is, I think they're playing the game the way it's set up to be played. If they stand aside and say, I don't want to play this game, it's unprincipled, they don't raise enough money and you won't even see them on the ballots, or they won't get the nomination of the party, or whatever the case is. So they have to play the money game in order to have a shot at winning any election, right? And so some of them hate it. There's the Center for Public Integrity put out a book about with interviews of members of Congress, and there's so many great quotes there about how they resent and feel humiliated and just bothered by the miserable routines that they have to sink into in order to obtain and maintain political office. So I do think on the inside there's a number of politicians who would love a different system and are really dying to be real leaders as opposed to these telemarketing automatons. But some of them don't want to do that. So clearly, yeah, the system is self-reinforcing, it's cyclical, it's hard to change the system once people are bought into it. But that goes to my whole point about making money in politics the most salient political issue that people vote on, and you could get changes that way. And there are stepping stones to working up to the constitutional amendment for sure. One of them is small donor laws that would give limited matching funds, not the kinds that would be unconstitutional, but limited funds to incentivize small donations or to match them. And so if you could get more and more people donating money, the theory goes, you could get office holders accountable to more and more people, and then change could occur eventually. But I really do hate the sound of making politics so economic and making the main form of political participation donating money. It still strikes me as commercial and just cheap. But it may be necessary in the short run.
Well, how do you feel about the relevancy of the growth of third parties? The Green Party has been making a lot of big noises about it growing. More and more states are coming on. At least they get people into local governments, and hopefully
Yeah.
from your board of supervisors, water commissions. It seems to me the possibility that
Yep.
you can change some of this access to money.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic. I think the change in the general direction that we need could be so multifaceted, and is and will be so multifaceted. And I think one of the reasons that you see, I think it's 500 municipalities, but hundreds of municipalities signing on and petitioning Congress to move for this, or their state to move for a constitutional convention, is that there are pockets of meaningful leadership at local levels for sure. So I'd be hopeful about that. But the sad part is it doesn't really matter in terms of facing off against the Supreme Court. You can't change your local or state election laws in ways that would contradict the Supreme Court. You need the constitutional amendment before you can do that. Yeah, in the back.
I was just curious, you had mentioned that capitalism was being weakened, and that seemed like a negative. So I wondered if you could explain that a bit. Is capitalism a positive thing? Is that something which we're working against? Isn't it capitalism that you're actually talking about as money being the supreme focus and influence in our politics?
Right. Well, see, I don't think that's capitalism when money becomes the supreme influence in our politics. That's crony capitalism. So that's a corruption of capitalism that's prevalent in a lot of Caribbean and Latin American and former Soviet countries. And so that routing, right, the way that system tends to work is economic competition is routed through political competition. You get big donors and spenders with economic interests trying to control politics for the purposes of obtaining advantages back in the marketplace, which corrupt the marketplace. So when I'm talking about capitalism, I'm talking about capitalism within its own sphere, not the kind of capitalism that takes over other spheres, whether it's the family, say, I don't know, by privatizing elder care, or whether it's taking over education by getting office holders to defund public education, and you get all these for-profit educational institutions, which often don't give students a very good education or very good job chances and charge them a lot of money, and then they're essentially sort of debt slaves for decades. Capitalism can sort of overspill its boundaries into many other spheres, whether it's the family, education, or politics. And so I'm in favor of a sort of confined economy.
So how do we get back to mom and pop capitalism?
Regulation, right? And that's what money in politics prevents. But I mean, these answers are way too easy, and I need to make the admission, which is that I've primarily studied the Supreme Court cases, and what I'm trying to do is expose the judicial rationale for all these changes. But clearly, I don't have the answers on so many of these substantive issues. I feel for everyone on them.
Relation between what happened in Nazi Germany with the jurists fiddling around with the laws to sort of facilitate Hitler.
Yeah, for sure.
That's what I could see. Yeah.
For sure. In terms of legal systems, right? You've got civil law, you've got common law. You used to have socialist law, which isn't what I'm talking about. What you're talking about with the Nazis per se, but in socialist legal systems. There was this phenomenon where U.S. courts wouldn't enforce the judgments of, say, some East German courts because they said that those judges were subservient to party officials, and they interpreted the law in accordance with the wishes of party officials. And so it wasn't really an independent legal system. And I think you could make a similar accusation of the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's ideological in their case. I don't think it's direct control by party officials as it was in certain cases that I think you're talking about. But yeah, the law will bow to the power center, and judges will look. This isn't as bad for our Supreme Court because they've got life tenure and they can barely be removed for anything. But with other courts, judges are sensitive to the constraints on them, and they want to please people who have power over them. So that's a natural human phenomenon, and especially with state judges who have to run for election and raise campaign funds, we get real problems like that, where I think you start to move not to socialist law, but to capitalist law, which is a legal system that facilitates the accumulation of capital in ways that lack judicial independence. Yeah.
I don't know if you follow California politics, but the election on Tuesday had provided an example of where big money, huge money, in Richmond, with Chevron being its biggest corporate citizen, they tried to buy mayor and town council, and somehow they failed. So it's almost like, in that instance, the court or some people say, yeah, climate change, global warming, well, look at all the cold weather and snow in the Midwest and East Coast right now. There's no such thing as climate change and global warming. Just open your eyes. And so they look at Richmond and Chevron and all of these deep pockets.
Right.
And it seems like an aberration. I don't know how they did win. But,
Yeah.
Maybe. So, do you have any?
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to point out, because money doesn't always have the last word.
Just usually.
So I have statistics on this. Some of the older statistics, which were tracking races for the House and for the Senate, showed that the candidate with the most amount of money won about 65% and 75% of the time. Less so, I think it was less so in the House and more so in the Senate. But regardless, the candidate with more money tended to win. And the more recent statistics show an even greater rate of the candidate with more money tending to win. But that doesn't prove causation. It doesn't prove that money's the reason they win. It's correlated with winning. It helps to win. In some cases, it may be the cause, because there was an extremely tight race, and then there was an ad buy in 2 days before the final vote, and the ad buy was to the tune of $700,000, and the competing campaign, the campaign that was disfavored by that ad, didn't have the money left and couldn't counter that speech. And that may have explained their narrow loss, right? I mean, you can certainly find cases where money seems to be determinative. As a general rule, I would just say, look, you've got the wealth primary. You've got the first election, which is who the donors and spenders want. And then that is the group of market-dominant candidates and parties who the citizens get to weigh in on. I think that's the general rule that always holds.
If we get Mitt Romney, another ultra-rich guy,
Yeah.
running against the wealthy Clintons.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any chance for a third party, like let's say Bernie Sanders? And
Right.
this guy is for the working class and middle class of America, but he
Right.
would probably not even get into debates because
Right.
he doesn't have that power.
Right. Yeah, it looks pretty grim right now.
Because he's contemplating running. I think if he had ran with Elizabeth Warren as vice president, I would.
Yeah. Well, so I hope he does run, because one of the things, again, is that to say that he's not going to win this time around doesn't mean that he won't get certain memes out there, right? He won't get certain incredibly important points out there, which can, little by little, take effect in the overall consciousness of the country. So, or that can happen. So I don't know. But I would be in favor of getting the incredibly important points that Bernie Sanders wants to make. I'd be in favor of getting those out.
Or maybe a gadfly like Dennis Kucinich.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I got you. It's hard to know whether, that leads to an outcome that you would like, but I think the process is a good one.
It's certainly a fiery word.
So.
Do you think that meme warfare can make its way around formal political structures or easily than constitutional amendments, for instance?
I don't know.
What was the question?
I don't know. Whether meme warfare can be more effective than formal constitutional structures, or can have a greater effect than the argument for a constitutional amendment.
What do you mean by meme warfare?
Like getting the meme out there, just like 99%, 1%.
Right.
I mean, had a big effect on people's thinking. That's what I mean by meaning.
Yeah, like the key ideas that take root that sort of spread in the public
Perception
consciousness.
problems.
Well, I kind of thought what happened last week couldn't happen because people were hip to the idea of how elections are bought. But apparently not,
Right.
because money did play a big role, especially when you look at what happened in Kansas. I just happened to see this thing,
Yeah.
Mayor, what's his name,
Yeah.
how the population, how the voters that were distracted by what was barely a scandal. So that Brownback was reelected, although a month before, it didn't seem like that was gonna happen.
Yeah. Well, I think there may be some people itching to take off. What I might do is stick around to talk to anyone who, but one more question, I guess, before we go. But I will stick around afterwards if people want to continue this. I just don't want to hold anyone in the middle hostage. Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you talk about memes and ideas, but I'm finding that younger people who haven't been subjected maybe to the same conditioning, a meme among them is that capitalism is structurally built on inequality and exploitation, and that there are alternatives, and that rather than, that we've got to fight, right? We've got to fight for what's happening right now, but I don't think they believe, and I sort of agree, that we can fix it so it's not exploited, and that I think all these struggles are important because they raise the issue of an inequality. I see that your book is titled Capitalism versus Democracy. So that would suggest to me that you're saying we can't really have democracy under capitalist economic
Right.
system. So that would
It's-
be what I
Right.
took away from.
It's not what I say. What I say is that if you use capitalism and capitalist ideology as a theory of constitutional interpretation, then you've pitted capitalism against democracy. What I say is that the Supreme Court has produced this power struggle by allowing moneyed interests to co-opt the political sphere. And so they've pitted capitalist actors, not really capitalism per se, but capitalist actors against the system that would be representative of most or all Americans. And, or if you like, they've pitted capitalism as a political system against democracy as a political system. But I think they can coexist, and they have to coexist. I mean, there's, of course, maybe there will be the sort of revolution you're talking about, and we'll move to some sort of totally socialized economy. But I don't get into that possibility at all. The possibility I get into is an equitable form of capitalism, a form of capitalism that the people could decide for themselves in terms of what the shape of it would be. And that only being possible when you have a political system that's representative, not run on consumer sovereignty. Yeah.
I'm seeing capitalism as intrinsically an economic
Yeah.
system, and the politics being a function of that.
Yeah.
And so, you can't really separate those two things. And so, where capitalism right now, which is just eating up everything
Right.
and polarizing society,
Right.
that this is symptomatic of that objective process, and politics is gonna follow. And so what I'm saying is, and the younger people are saying, let's conceive of something really different, so we're not always fighting the symptoms.
Yep.
And I'm not in contradiction with anything you said. I'm just saying, in the context of, yes, that we could go beyond capitalism without losing some of the good features, without losing democracy.
Yeah.
In fact, completing democracy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that line of thought, I think, comes out of the lack of separation between the two systems. You're saying that capitalism is so dominant that it ends up co-opting democracy, but that's that's a result that the Supreme Court has produced by the margin of one justice. Because if it wasn't for that one justice in cases like Citizens United and McCutcheon, there would be much stricter limits on economic power in the political sphere. And so we can't even imagine it, because we've never had a democratic system where office holders are actually autonomous from large moneyed interests. And if they were actually autonomous, it's hard to predict exactly what the laws and policies would be, but you could imagine they could be different. They could be different. Today, they certainly won't be. I think I would end it there if no one objects, and I'll stick around, I promise. But thanks again for your questions.